Can you tell the difference between an SUV versus a crossover? Actually, it might not be as easy as you'd think. Just look at a 2022 Ford Explorer, for example. On the surface, it's widely marketed as an SUV, but it's actually a crossover. So what's the difference? But more than that, today I'll tell you why you shouldn't buy a crossover. On the outside, both may look similar, but inside they're fundamentally different. A key difference between a crossover and an SUV lies within their chassis. The crossover is built on a car platform, meaning that it's a one-piece design. In other words, the body of the car and the frame form a single structure. But in a large SUV, the body is attached to a separate frame, and in that way it's built more like a truck. In fact, full-size SUVs are actually classified in America as light trucks. SUVs typically have a higher ground clearance and a higher center of gravity than a crossover. The term crossover was originally coined to dispel the bad reputation older SUVs and pickup trucks had with poor fuel economy and high maintenance costs. A crossover is smaller and has a lower ground clearance than a full-size SUV, but compared to a sedan, it's usually larger in size and has a higher ground clearance than the sedan. So, we can say that crossovers are more like hatchbacks. Thanks to their strong one-piece passenger car chassis, they're able to handle tight turns much better, like in city traffic. All this is to say it's called a crossover because it's a mix between an SUV and a conventional passenger car. Today, crossovers have been one of the fastest growing segments in the U.S. car market. Generally, crossovers can be divided into two types: front-wheel drive, FWD, and all-wheel drive, or AWD. Let's talk about all-wheel drive crossovers and why you need to run from it like the plague. Then we'll look at front-wheel drive ones. So if you ask the driver an all-wheel drive, AWD, crossover, which drive is better, most likely they'll choose all-wheel drive. They'll go to great lengths to explain their urgent need for all-wheel drive, how it helps them accelerate through snowdrifts and wet dirt roads. They'll also describe their feelings of comfort and confidence when starting and driving on slippery winter roads, or when they're on rural areas for hunting or fishing. But when you ask them how many times a year they find themselves in such situations, most of the times it turns out to be just a small handful of times, if ever. Because in actuality, most all-wheel drive crossovers spend the majority of their time driving in urban areas on paved roads. You might also hear stories about the average all-wheel drive crossover owner who has heard of electronic stabilizing systems that help his crossover in bad winter weather in the city. However, he doesn't realize one simple thing. The same electronic brain also helps him take off at a traffic light in snowy conditions. This is the same way it can choke the motor when sliding in the snow that's left over from the snowplow. The fact is, the so-called differential locks, which allow you to enjoy the benefits of all-wheel drive, are not real in crossovers, but it's just an electronically controlled emulation of it. It simply slows down the wheel that is starting to slip or cuts the power coming from the engine. This means only one thing: if driving conditions are difficult for a sedan with front-wheel drive with regular tires, then it will most likely be difficult with a crossover as well. This is well understood by crossover owners who truly understand their car's real capabilities, or those who've learned this through a bad experience after they've already bought one. When it comes to driving in winter conditions, most city drivers don't pump on the gas pedal after they lose control. This is a known fact. Instinctively, the foot reaches for the brake pedal, so this is where you'll get in trouble. In this area, four-wheel drive won't help much either. On the contrary, it can worsen the situation by giving the driver a false sense of security, which leads him to drive faster rather than slowing down. So it turns out that the advantage of an all-wheel drive crossover comes down only to the inner conviction of its owner. Because in 99% of cases, the potential advantages of the so-called all-wheel drive of the crossover are either not exploited or they're canceled out by so-called smart electronics. The disadvantages of the all-wheel drive crossover are quite clear. First, you'll likely pay more for it. Then you'll have to fork over even more money when it's time for maintenance. In addition, an all-wheel drive transmission consumes more power produced by the engine than a two-wheel drive transmission. This will lead to additional fuel consumption. Look, most crossover owners drive in urban areas. They're not. That's a fact. Which goes to show that clever advertising worked in a way that it swayed them to buy a car with features they really don't need most of the time. But judge for yourself. All-wheel drive has more parts that run idle most of the time, which, by the way, reduces its lifespan. There are two axles, not one, as with front-wheel drive, as well as the drive shaft and rear axle. And here, two more differentials, center and rear transfer case, and a vicious coupling unit, and more. All this adds at least 200 pounds of weight to the car, or possibly more. It's all about fuel consumption. There are a lot of parts that are spinning in oil and they really need to be monitored. Some manufacturers will recommend changing the gear oil in them. And if any oil seal leaks, the whole assembly may fail. I mean, the cost of maintaining an all-wheel drive crossover far exceeds the cost of servicing a front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive sedan. Now about the all-wheel drive itself. The presence of such a drive in a crossover may make you think that now you can drive off-road in the mud. But actually, this is far from the case. This is because with crossovers, all-wheel drive is very conditional. And they aren't really intended for serious off-roading. They just weren't designed for it. Often, on many occasions, all-wheel drive is connected through a vicious coupling or electric coupling unit. This vicious coupling transfers torque through a special fluid contained in its housing. For example, when one axle begins to slip, the fluid in the viscous coupling quickly hardens, thereby closing the rear axle. Seems like a good solution, but the downside is that it's almost impossible to turn it off or on yourself or lock the rear differential to work. It also turns on only after the slipping, so the efficiency of such a full drive is quite low. Now, what if the crossover with all-wheel drive doesn't have viscous coupling, but an electric coupling? Well, this type of coupling works differently. There isn't a special liquid here. Instead, there are electromagnets that open or close the discs when the voltage is applied to them, thereby connecting or disconnecting the all-wheel drive. The clutch is dry. There aren't any oils used in it, which is both good and bad at the same time. Good because you don't need to monitor the seals for leakage or change the fluid. That's a big plus. But the bad is that these clutches can quickly overheat. Here's how it works. The connection of the all-wheel drive occurs after the front wheel drive begins to slip. Press the button and the rear axle will lock. It seems that the solution with force blocking is much better than with a viscous coupling. But the problem is that the electric clutch overheats very quickly. So if it's engaged for a long time, the electromagnetic clutch will turn off after 3 to 5 minutes of slipping. You'll just have to sit in a deep puddle of mud waiting for this clutch to cool down so it can start all over again. Also, because of this overheating, the electric clutch fails quicker and you can't drive at all on asphalt in this mode. A better option is the hydromechanical clutch. This is designed very similar to the electromagnetic version, only here the discs open and close due to oil pressure, which is pumped by a pump located inside the clutch itself. But again, this doesn't guarantee that you'll be using four-wheel drive on a daily basis, and if you do, the likelihood is a crossover caught in a real off-road situation will get you out is very small. Yes, I'm sure that no sane driver will simply drive into such difficult terrain to test it out, but still, it's best to keep in mind this principle. If you're sure that a sedan can pass through a place, then a crossover can too. So the question arises, is it really worth paying more to get a crossover? Actually, if you live in a city where the snow is regularly plowed and you leave the city to places where there's just a few meters of dirt, then buying a crossover with an all-wheel drive system is just money down the drain. Consider this. For the price of a mid-size crossover with C-class equipment, you can buy a business sedan from the same manufacturer. But what if you live in a rural area where roads at certain times of the year can be closed off, or where there's a lot of snow in the winter? Then I'm here to tell you that a crossover is also not for you. A crossover is too fragile for such conditions. In those situations, you should think about a more robust vehicle like a full-size SUV or heavy truck. So you can see that all-wheel drive crossovers might look glamorous, but it's not as efficient in the city in general, nor powerful enough for serious off-roading needs. But it's the marketing campaigns that give consumers the wrong notion about the all-wheel drive crossover being an off-road conqueror. Of course, there are benefits to the crossover having a higher ground clearance than a standard car. For example, better towing capability than a sedan. But you have to ask yourself, how much you'll actually be towing with that compared to all the extra dollars you'll need to dish out to purchase and maintain it. Add to this that the clutch is a weak point for many crossovers. Even when driving on front-wheel drive on asphalt, the car always rotates the gears in the rear differential. All this slows down the car, not to mention the fact that it also adds a lot of weight to the car, making it even heavier. So draw your own conclusions. But what about the front-wheel drive crossovers? Are they any better? Can you justify its extra price? Does a slightly higher ground clearance mean greater cross-country ability? Doesn't it have more room for family and cargo? In my opinion, I don't think so. A station wagon can more than outbeat a crossover in all these areas. In terms of practicality, a mid-sized crossover will never even come close to a station wagon, let alone a compact crossover. So if you really want to have a car with all-wheel drive, why not consider a station wagon with four-wheel drive? Or why not think about a hatchback or even a sedan? It'd be less expensive. Personally, I think an ideal family car is a station wagon. Yes, they might not be as cool these days, but they are very practical, comfortable, and make a well-balanced vehicle. Everyone knows that a lower ground clearance means more fun driving experience and safer. They won't roll over as easy. Just look at sedans, hatchbacks, and station wagons and how they corner better. But a higher center of gravity in the average crossover means you can't drive like that. The same can be said about fuel efficiency. Although most crossovers today have improved in this regard, it isn't enough to say that they are more economical than a sedan. But now you tell me, if you have an all-wheel drive crossover, how often do you use these features? Knowing what you know now, would you trade it for another car if you could? Please share your opinion by commenting below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for your support.